Happy Sunday, everybody. Or if you're across the pond, maybe happy Monday. But I hope you're doing well. So this week we actually have a lot to talk about. We have World's Championship is happening this weekend, and I'll be talking about it on Monday, as well as the changes that we've seen to Best of One since we saw the Leyline of Resonance get banned in Best of One Standard. So, um, Today, what we're going to be talking about, though, are my off-meta picks. So every Sunday, what I do is I look at decks that have at least 50 matches and a 60% win rate that placed well into Mythic, so successfully piloted into Mythic. And this is just, I enjoy doing this because although it's nice to talk about what the top performing decks are on Monday, there are many, many different ways to hit Mythic. And these decks have been performing quite well. And so we'll talk about their matchups and kind of just their general strategy really quick. This one's Dimir Poison by Awesome Ted. Went 72 and 33 for a 69% win rate into Mythic. I've bumped into Dimir Poison. You definitely bump into it more in Diamond and in Mythic. And it's been a strategy. It's a strategy that's been around for a while, right? So we can give them poison counters directly, which is particularly handy against control decks that are really creature centric, that have a lot of removal and wraths. And then once they have the poison counter, we can start proliferating those poison counters with like experimental augury and serum snare, the -4/-4 that this one's not running. There's a couple of different versions, right? Whisper of the Dross proliferates, so you can end up giving them the 10 poison counters to win the game, even without having to do direct damage. So this one's also not running like the Skull Dweller, which is a 1/1 with the Toxic, so that's more prone to interaction. But it has more interaction itself against the other creature-centric strategies. So we've got like the Vortex to be able to bounce something. We've got the cut down for removal as well as the Anoint with Affliction. Anoint with Affliction working particularly well in this one because you will get corrupted, and then this is just one of the best instance removals if they have the 3 poison counters. Go for the Throat and then Shieldred's Edict. So we also have the counterspell Bring the Ending, which moves from a quench into just a direct counterspell if they're also corrupted. And then Experimental Augury is able to dig through your deck, and Vraska's Fall helps you control the board while giving them poison counters. And the new card that we got that I've seen in some versions, not all, but is running in this one, is the Tale of Tameo. And this kind of works like the Blue Saga that mills and then lets you play a card from your graveyard, right? So the first 3, you're just milling your cards, and then if you mill 2 cards that share a card type, which this deck has a fair amount of instances and sorceries, then you get to draw a card, and then at the final chapter you get to exile an instant or sorcery from your graveyard, copy them, and you can then cast that you may cast any number of the copies. So that's particularly nice for just, chaining off a whole bunch of proliferates to kind of win the game. So very interesting deck. As far as the matchups go, I think it's relatively well set up in the meta because, so for example, the pilot here, Awesome Ted, went 77% against Boros, which I assume is Boros Auras, 50% against Azorius Oculus because it's a little bit harder to interact with that deck, 64% against Mono Red, and 82% against Mono Black. So really punishing Mono Black for running as much creature-centric single-point removal. Second one that caught my attention here was Mono White Control by Owen Wilson, and went 55 and 32 for a 63% win rate. And this one's another one that you'll see more commonly in Best of 3 and higher up in the ladder. You might bump into Mono White Control. That's been my experience at least. And the deck is also similar to Mono White tokens, so they're kind of sharing a space right now. Whether or not they're Mono White tokens, Mono White Control, they're kind of very similar. So Enduring Innocence, whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters, you draw a card, which works really well with all of your little tokens, being able to draw your cards off of Beza, Archangel Elspeth, Carrot Cake. And Caretaker's Talent also gives you the card draw. So this works really well against the decks that are trying to trade 1-for-1 on your resources. Some versions do run Temporary Lockdown against Boros Auras. This one's leaning on the Exercise as a way to give the enchantment and an artifact hate. You can blow up their sheltered by ghosts, and so you've got a fair amount of single point interaction with the get lost. Lay down arms works well against aggro because this deck is looking to win in the long run. You also have the Sunfall. So once you get to the Sunfall, you can kind of just wrath the board, and then you've got, your Fountain Port is actually pretty handy in this deck because it gives you a lot of card draw off of your token production that you're making off of like the Archangel Elspeth, and Sunken Citadel helps pay for the Fountain Port. So as far as the matchups go, this is another deck that really preys on mono black, having very few targets to actually interact with all that interaction. So 87% against mono black. Went 75% against Boros Auras, so looking like the temporary lockdown is not needed for that matchup. It went 50% against Rakdos Aggro, and some of the climbs did occur before we had the Leyline ban. All of these decks hit Mythic after, right? But some of the gameplay happened before the ban, right? And so I don't know how much of that Rakdos Aggro was coming in from prior to the Leyline bind. But considering its worst matchup and that deck just got worse, it's a good thing for mono white control. And the other one that it did really well against was 75% against Azorius Oculus. All right, third up on the list here is Bant Control, and this is the one that we're, sometimes it's going to be calling 4-color overlords. We're seeing it a lot in we're seeing it replace domain basically in best of 3, and so this is all of these lists were run on the best of 1 ladder, unless I made a mistake. So this one went 41 and 20, and I totally forgot to write down the person's name who piloted it, so hold please. Nilo. Let me get that written down. Okay. By Nilo, went 41 and 20 for a 67% win rate. And there's a fair... So basically, we've got the Up the Beanstalk, which then works really well to with the Leyline binding for the card draw. And we're just trying to get into playing these really busted enchantments. Now, some versions are running like Zur to be able to cheat these out and be able to attack with them. Saw that explored. Haven't really seen it since. We're also playing the counter spells of No More Lies and 3 Steps Ahead. And you just, basically stall until these bad boys take over the game and give you a ton of value. So, and then just removal of Get Lost for single point interaction and Sunfall for a sweeper. So pretty straightforward strategy. Kind of curious to see. You can see that this was a best of 3 list. So if you want to play it in best of 3, there is a full sideboard as well. But I won't cover that yet, or won't today. So as far as its matchups go, it's another deck that plays pretty well on the mono black archetypes, so 78% there. I think we've seen a lot of people shift over to mono black after the Leyline ban. We'll see if that trend continues. It struggles a little bit against Boros Auras, so it went 44% against Boros Auras. If you wanted to improve that matchup, you could bring in the temporary lockdown. That helps quite a bit against that matchup. Although, people have mentioned like it becomes this game of cat and mouse, because if they play their Sheltered by Ghosts on your temporary lockdown, then they get all of their stuff back, right? So, but I've found it to be helpful, and the tracker, I think, puts it at like 70%, something like that, game in hand win rate against Boros Auras, so it seems like a pretty decent counter. It does really well against Azorius Oculus, so it's a 71% against Azorius Oculus, and then it struggles against Dimir, which might be Dimir Mill, might be Dimir Control, and I probably think it's Dimir Poison. The downside with the tracker is it doesn't tell me which version it is, so it was 40% against Dimir. All right, fourth one up here is Mono Black Slasher. Looks like I also forgot the name of the pilot here, which I like to mention, so let me just pull it up real quick. Apologize. And this one was by Nakayu. And we've talked about Mono Black Slasher for before, right? So it's not a new deck, if you will, but it's a less popular version than the mono black discard, partly because it requires mythics and rares, and it's more expensive than the mono black discard strategy. But this one was piloted 82 and 53 for a 61% win rate into Mythic, and Yeah, so you've got the combination of the Unstoppable Slasher to then just win the game if you have the Bloodletter of Aclazotz in play. You also have 4 copies of the Unholy Annex and the Ritual Chamber, which then, off of the demons of Archfiend of the Dross, the Bloodletter of Aclazotz, and the demon itself can create, switches over into a win condition in and of itself. And pairs pretty well with Shieldred because you're drawing that card as well, so you're gaining the life. Rush of Dread here also gives you a 1-turn kill option that's not board dependent. So Rush of Dread with Aclazotz has been a combo since Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And then we have a plethora of removal options. So this is what makes it good against all of the creature-centric strategies, is you've got the cut downs, the go for the throats, Shieldred's Edict, Anoint with Affliction. Deep Cavern Bat and Duress help up against the control matchups, so I like that inclusion. The Avarice allows you to tutor, and you can also just use it as a burn spell. Depending on how many Bloodletter of Aclazotz you have in play, this can just win you the game with direct damage. And then 1 Ghost Vacuum here to help against Azorius Control, Azorius Oculus, which tends to be the most graveyard-centric strategy. But it also works as an alternative win condition if you've removed a whole bunch of creatures. Popping this and sacrificing it is actually a way to win the game. There's a little bit in the best of 3 sideboard here where the pilot was just considering some inclusions, like a little bit more graveyard hate for Azorius Oculus, Liliana the Veil for against control, and Deadly Cover-Up for a little bit of the board flood strategies, which I'll talk about on Monday since we lost the Rakdos Aggro, since we lost the Leyline and Rakdos Aggro. Celestia Rabbits has been popping up because it was being held back by how good the Leyline deck was against it. So. But more on that on Monday. As far as its matchups, the went 88% against Mono Black, so really hurting the Mono Black discard deck itself. I assume 69% against Mono Red. And that's another clue that Mono Black in the tracker was referring mostly to discard, was because if you were playing against the mirror match, you wouldn't expect an 88% win rate. 69% against Mono Red, 47% against Boros Auras, and 50% against Rakdos. Again, don't know how much of that is pre and post ban. Number 5 here is Gruul Aggro by Cider. Not a new deck as well, just one that, good to keep on your radar in case you're returning to Standard and you have no idea what I'm talking about for the last couple of weeks. It's okay to have a little bit of repetition, right? So this one went 59 and 25 for a 70% win rate. And is very similar to the mono red strategy. You've got the mouse synergies of Manifold Mouse, Emberheart Challenger, and Heartfire Hero that we've all known to come and love or hate. It is running the turn inside out despite not having the Leyline. You've got the Torch the Towers instead of Shocks, and the upside to this is being able to exile a card but not be able to shoot their face directly. Also has the Slick Shot Show Off, which is a little bit of an all-in strategy, but in Gruul you have the ability to protect it with Snakeskin Veil, which makes it a little less prone to the mono black removal. Innkeeper's Talent is a way to kind of extend the mid-range of this deck, and you can use it to trigger your Valiant triggers off of your mice over and over, and then also gives you the Ward 1, which can kind of help protect your threats. And then the Questing Druid can grow into a large threat if you play it out as a 2-drop and then follow it up with a bunch of red spells. Or later in the mid-game, you can use it for more dig, depending on how we're flooding and etc. Rockface Village here is more of a combat trick than it is actually a land. At least that's the way I like to approach it, is to not count it as one of the lands. And use this as a repeatable combat trick to trigger your Valiant. As far as the matchups go, oh man, I was not prepared today. I've dropped a little bit on my notes, so let me just pull it up real quick. Jeez. It's the bad downside of doing it throughout the week is sometimes I miss it. So this one was 47% against Mono Black, so Mono Black does disrupt this strategy pretty heavily. It's also 50% against Azorius Oculus. It's 6 and 3, so 67% against Mono White, and 75% against Mono Red. So those are its top 4. It looks like it has an 8 and 0 against Golgari on the climb as well. So certain matchups particularly weak to the Mono Red package. And oh, by the way, I might as well just do a quick little plug, right? One way to help support my channel, and which 5 of you have done, is download the tracker from Untapped. It does help me out. They give me $1 or whatever, and but I've found it to be particularly helpful in understanding the intricacies of the meta, and you can use it to track your own games and see what matchups you've been coming up against the most often. And it doesn't work on mobile, is the one downside, but other than that, it's been a particularly useful tool, and I include it in every description. It's in the video descriptions of all of my videos. So number 6 here is Rakdos Sacrifice, and hopefully this time I wrote everything down. Yes, I did. All right, so this one was by Callie, and went 43 and 27 for a 61% win rate. This is another deck that I've seen more often in the higher ranks of like Diamond and Mythic, and part of it is because of what decks it's countering, right? So you've got the Urabrask's Forge, which gives you a really nice sack target, as well as something that triggers a sacrifice. You've got the Rottenmouth Viper, which you can use to then sacrifice kind of your fodder that you get off of Greedy Freebooter, the Fear of Lost Teeth, Spiteful Hexmage, giving you 2 things to sacrifice in 1 card. Hopeless Nightmare is also a really great target to sacrifice. So you've got a whole bunch of things that are like, let's look to sacrifice them to either 1, cheat out the Rottenmouth Viper, 2, use Braids to outvalue your opponent, because you do have a fair amount of control with the Final Vengeance, Nowhere to Run, Go for the Throat, and Liliana of the Veil. And then you've also got Disturbing Mirths, which you can then sacrifice for card draw as well. So you're kind of trying to just out-attrition them over time, and can be a pretty handy strategy against certain matchups. So Callie went 79% against Boros, 56% against Azorius, and 56 against Mono Red. Both of those were just by 1 match, so close to a coin flip on Azorius and Mono Red. Does well against the Boros Auras deck though, and does well against the Mono Black discard strategy. And part of the reason why Mono Black discard is so popular is because it's so cheap, right? And a lot of the cheap to craft decks are more popular on the ladder. And I've talked about Mono Black discard for 5 weeks now. It's around, it's okay, you can climb with it to Mythic, but it's not one of the top performing archetypes. But because of how popular it is, it's a really great one to target if you want to try to climb to Mythic. Number 7 here is 4-color Domain. You may hear this referred to as Witch Domain, which is just the colors of Atraxa, so everything but red, from back in the day. And so this one was done by Hugog, went 77 and 40 for a 66% win rate into Mythic. And this one taking an alternative to the Bant Overlords or the Bant Control deck, leaning more into the classic threats of Atraxa and Herd Migration, still doing the domain thing, which is enabled quite well by the Overlord of the Hauntwoods, giving you a land that is every color type. And then we've got Archangel of Wrath to help stabilize. This deck's been around since the previous Worlds with Reed Duke, so still kicking around even in best of 1. And again, this was another one that's more popular in best of 3, but you can run it in best of 1. This person looks like they did just take a best of 3 list and add in a sideboard. A couple of ones that I haven't seen though before, so like Calamity's Wake. Interesting. As far as the matchups go, it's good against Azorius, went 67%. That I assume means Azorius Oculus, because the deck in the past has struggled a little bit with Azorius Control. That's not a particularly... You will not bump into Azorius Control all that often until you get into Mythic. It's 64% against Mono Black. It's 23% against Mono Red. This deck does not like Mono Red. And... but it got 100% 11 and 0 against Orsov. All right, number 8 here is Dimir Mill by Alan. Went 75 and 49 for a 60% win rate. And I talked about this one last week during my off-meta picks. I think we had 3 different versions of Dimir Mill. But basically trying to use the Doomsday Excruciator, which brings both players down to 6 cards in their library, makes it particularly easy to kill, finish it off with Jace, the Perfected Mind. And if you're playing up against another deck that's like countering your strategy, it's kind of like the Teresian Mindbreaker, but without being able to unearth it, makes it so that it's a little bit more dependent on specifically it being cast, right? And then we've got like the Farsight Ritual here, which is trying to replace the Memory Deluge from before rotation, and it's doing an okay job. We've got a lot of single point interaction, so Shieldred's Edict, Nowhere to Run, Go for the Throat, Anoint with Affliction, Disfigure. A lot of these being kind of pointed against Boros Auras, right? This is good against Heartfire Hero to eliminate its power. The Shieldred's Edict allows you to cause them to sacrifice their creature if they've already Voltroned it and gotten several instances of ward that you can't get through. Nowhere to Run lets you get through those instances of ward without having to worry about it. Negate here helps up against the other control matchups, so like if you're trying to play this and they're going to counter it, then you negate their counter. Deduce is good if they're playing around your counter spells, so 3 steps ahead, and Phantom Interference. And so the deck is pretty good against the Boros Auras. It's a little bit more of a coin flip, went 57%. It went 38% against Azorius. And again, I think that's because it's weak to the Azorius Control as well as Azorius Oculus. And went 77% against Mono Black. So there's a theme here, right? If you're above 60% against Mono Black, you're probably an off-meta pick. And then they also went 77% against Dimir. So other Dimir control decks, probably the majority of those matchups are Dimir Poison. Alright, and the last deck that I'd like to talk about is actually Azorius Control. This one, again, is a deck that you will see more commonly in Mythic and in high ranks. I have, when I did my climb this last season, I didn't bump into Azorius Control like once, right? I don't think I bumped into the archetype a single time. So the point of this deck, right, is disruption and control, as is usual for Azorius Control. Hornblock Whale, being able to bounce a creature can be devastating to certain strategies. Sunfall being able to wipe the board. This one is running the temporary lockdowns for to help up against the Boros Auras strategy. Running a little bit fewer counter spells than we usually see in this archetype specifically. So we've got the 3 steps ahead and only 3 copies of it, which again kind of points to Azorius Control not being very popular in the meta, because when it is popular in the meta, you see he who has the most counter spells wins the matchup in Azorius Control, right? Who's the deepest into control wins the control versus control matchup, and it's super grindy, right? So this one is just more preying on the meta-specific picks. So Kutzel's Flanker here is really good against Azorius Oculus to hate on the graveyard. Temporary Lockdown for Boros Auras. Soul Partition also gives you some good single point interaction against the mono red decks. And Split Up gives you a cheap Wrath that I was curious to see if it would actually replace the temporary lockdown. I don't think it will. Vanish into Eternity is one that we also don't really see a whole lot, and giving you some alternative hate. I don't know if I like this better than just like an exercise, right? But one of a quick study as well for some card draw. And then Jace is the win condition of the deck. Let's mill them out. And we can also finish them off through Restless Anchorage or Mirrex. So 2 Disenchants for being considered in the sideboard, I'm guessing, instead of the Vanish into Eternity, and maybe the Quick Study. And I think Exercise should be a consideration as well. So the matchups for this one was, it's really great against Mono Red, went 69% against Mono Red. A little bit worse against Boros Auras, but still 59% is pretty good. It's 84 against Azorius Oculus, and I think that's one of the reasons why you'll see it. And then 62% against Mono Black. So against the top 4 most common matchups that this person experienced on their climb, all above 50% win rate, I think is partly why you see Azorius Control being played in the higher ranks of Mythic, where everybody's just jamming Boros Auras and Azorius Oculus. So thank you for coming and listening to me on a Sunday. I hope these all find you well. I always enjoy doing them. And tomorrow I'll be talking about the world's best of 3 decks and what the tracker says the best performing decks in best of 1 are post ban for Leyline of Resonance. So like I mentioned, we see a little bit more rabbits. So I'm excited because I've been talking about rabbits for several weeks, and now they finally have their time in the sun. So take care, everybody, and I will catch you all tomorrow.